Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel and to another video. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at this dining table that I made. Now this is a massive 7.5 feet long by 42 inches wide. It's got turn legs from Carolina Leg Company. I'll show you exactly how I did every step to build this table, and I'll also include the dimensions in the description in case you want to build this table for yourself. All right, so with that said, let's get right into the action. So first things first was to unpack the legs that I'll be using for this table. Now these are turned legs from Carolina Leg Company. I don't have a whole lot to say about these legs other than that they're awesome. I really like them. So if you're thinking about using them, stop thinking and just go ahead and get them. Also, I am not sponsored nor affiliated with Carolina Leg Companies, so these are my own opinions on their products. Alright, so to get these things started, I'm going to cut mortises in these legs, and then the aprons will have a tenon on them. So the marks you can see right there are from a cut-off piece of the apron, which I have right here, which I measured previously to go where the mortise will end up on each side. So I'll cut the mortise using my router with 2 edge guides on each side, and the edge guides will keep the mortises consistently in the same place on each piece of the leg. So I cut one hole on the inside of the first line and then the other hole on the inside of the other line, which will be where the mortises will go. After I have each of the first holes marked, then I just kind of chew the middle out using the router. So this is a plunge router, plunged to about 2 inches here, which will be the length of the tenon whenever I put the apron pieces in. If you're interested in this router, the legs, the router bit, or any of the other products in the video, you can check out the description where I have a link to each product as well as all the dimensions of everything I used in the video. So here's a look at the mortise after I have it cut out on the first side. Cut out pretty easily overall. Then I have it on this side, so I'll cut the other mortise out on this side. I did pre-mark these, and one thing you'll notice is that I flipped the orientation of the leg on this other slot, which will keep the mortises consistent on each side of the leg for where I put the aprons. This will all make a whole lot more sense here in a minute once we get all these cut out. So here's a closer look at the mortises. Now each leg will have 2 mortises adjacent to each other on the legs, which will be where the aprons go in after they have a tenon cut on them. So for the aprons, I'm using just a regular 2x4, and I begin milling this up on the joiner. So I will face joint one side, and then after I've face jointed that flat, I'll joint one edge of the 2x4, which will square it up and give me a nice 90-degree angle on one edge of the board to work with. Next we head over to the table saw, and I'm measuring the distance for the width that I want the aprons to be. So I cut these at 3 inches wide, so I just ripped the other edge off. Now the edge that I jointed goes up against the fence, and because it mirrors the edge that I cut on that, I'll have a perfectly flat 3-inch board for the aprons. After I have the apron ripped to the width that I want, I head over to the planer and I plane down the opposite side of the face that I jointed earlier. So this 3-tool process will give me a perfectly squared and milled up apron piece for the aprons on this table. The next step was to cross cut all of the apron pieces to length. So I did use 4 of the 2x4x8s here, so you only saw me mill one board just to keep you from having to watch every single board being milled. But I did use 4 of them. Like I mentioned, all of the lengths and the dimensions of these boards can be found in the description if you are interested in those. In order to connect the apron pieces to the mortises and the legs, I'll be using my tenon sled. So I grabbed these setup blocks, which are super useful because the router bit to cut the mortise out is exactly 1/2 inch. So you can see that this 1/2 inch setup block sets perfectly down in that mortise. So this is a scrap piece from the apron, and I'm just making a rough measurement on this, but that's the piece that I want to leave whenever I cut these tenons out. So I roughly mark this on a scrap piece and then adjust the dado blade kind of somewhere in the neighborhood to where that is. Now this first cut here will not be perfect, and that's okay because like I said, this is a scrap piece. So if this is too long or too short on the tenon piece in the middle, I can just cut it off and try again until I get that measurement perfectly. So I'm actually using this scrap piece to line it up here. So that was my first go there at the tenon, and you can see that I cut way too much off with the dado blade because the tenon fits loosely. That's no good. So I will cut that piece off and then go back to my tenon sled, make a slight adjustment and try again. So because I cut too much off the first time, I lowered the blade to leave a little bit of extra tenon there, and then I just tried this again. Now this piece here, you can see that the tenon is a lot thicker on there, and when I go to test it out, the fit of it, it was actually a little bit too much, so I went the wrong way. So I raised the blade up just a little, tried it again, and then I finally got it to where it needed to be. After I had the tenon width figured out, I put a stop block just under 2 inches, which would give me a consistent measurement to cut all of the tenons out. So when I plunged the mortises with the router earlier, I cut them right at 2 inches, so cutting this just under 2 inches would be the perfect measurement to leave the tenon to where this would fit perfectly in the mortises. So with what you're seeing me do here, I am still practicing this on the scrap piece of board that I was using earlier. So this is not actually one of the aprons, but I did this process on each of the aprons. So after you have the tenon cut out, you have the problem of the tenon being rectangular or square whenever the mortise is round. So I cut the edges off with a chisel, and then you can see here that it fits pretty well perfectly down in that mortise that we cut earlier. And just like that, we have the classic mortise and tenon joinery. So I've been trying to do this a lot more rather than using pocket holes or other methods. This takes a while longer, but it's very, very strong, and it's really a good technique to use whenever you're doing something for this type of joinery. Now I mentioned on that board that you just saw me do that was a scrap piece of board. So here I just wanted to show what it looks like whenever I'm using the crosscut sled to make these with the dado blade. So these are the actual apron pieces. You can see this is the side apron, and then here this is the very long front apron. Now to be completely honest, I did find having this long of an apron pretty challenging to use on the crosscut sled, but it did end up working out. I just had to hold constant pressure down close to the blade, which ended up working fine despite being just a little difficult. So next I cut some grooves in the long apron for where the support braces would go across this. So again, I used the setup blocks, and then I clamped a stop block probably a third of the way or so down the apron. Then after I made the first cut, I flipped the apron piece around and made the second cut. This was just to give it somewhat equal spacing on the apron. So here's the first and the second, and we'll see more on the braces that go in these a little later in the video. After all the tenon pieces were cut out on each of the apron, I took a couple of the chippers out on the dado blade, making it a little bit thinner in order to add a nice little groove on each piece of the apron. So once again, I grabbed a setup block and I used this to measure the depth of the groove that I would cut out on each piece of the apron. And then all you do is just simply run each piece over top of the dado blade, so this will leave a nice groove on one side of each board. I like to put it probably 5/6 of the way or so down on each piece of the apron, and this isn't completely necessary. I just think that looks really cool, and it kind of gives the table a highlight point for some extra detail whenever you're looking at it and it's finished. I think it looks awesome. If you don't have a dado blade, you can do the same thing with a regular table saw blade, just shifting the blade, or there are also several ways to do this using a router. With all of the grooves on the aprons cut, it was time to assemble them in the mortises on the legs that we cut earlier. So one thing that's important to remember here is that that groove that you cut on all of the aprons needs to face the same way on every piece. Otherwise, they won't match up going from side to side, and you'll definitely notice that. So I like to put the groove down, just make sure that it is facing the same way on each piece. As far as the actual assembly goes with the mortise and tenon on the legs and apron, it's pretty straightforward. You put a little bit of glue either in the mortises or on the tenons. You don't need a ton of glue, because when you put the tenon in the mortise, if it's filled up with glue, there's nowhere for the glue to go, so it will shoot out and get all over the leg and everything else that you don't want it to get on. Once I finally had everything assembled, I put some big pipe clamps across the length of this, and then I used bar clamp to clamp across the width of this. Now one thing you can notice here, especially on the pipe clamps, is that I put some walnut blocks or just any type of scrap wood to keep them from bending in and making a mark on that wood, because that will show. And now we're at the point of where we're putting those center braces in. So I did this after everything was dry and I already had the clamps off, but basically I'm just making a mark, and then I'm going to cut these center pieces out the same way that I did with the tenons earlier, and they'll fit right down in that gap that I cut out. So I had pre-cut these to the desired length across the width of the table to where they would fit right down in those slots, and then when I have a tenon cut out, it slides right down in there. So I dry fit everything first, then I put some glue on those, kind of like I just did with the mortises and the tenons, and then I put them into place. I put bar clamps across these, and I usually leave the clamps on for maybe a day or so depending on how busy I am, but I think I left the clamps on until the next day on not only the center braces but the main outside frame as well. So after everything was finally dry the next day, I flipped the table over, and now I'm going to put some recessed leveling feet adjusters in each of the legs, and that will allow the height of each leg to be slightly adjusted in case the floor isn't level at the final place that this table is going to go. So this is a pretty simple process. All you do is burr out the inside of the leg a little bit with a Forstner bit or a spade bit. Then you drill down into that hole that you burrowed out. You put this collar in there with the locking twist on it, and then you use a hex key to tighten that down in, and then the leveling feet will actually screw down in there. So I like to recess them all the way so that they don't stick out. Also, if the floor is level, they can just be hid up in the legs. Also, I did a previous video on this in a lot more detail as far as what I'm doing here, so I'll leave a link to that video in the description that goes into some more detail on these leveling adjusters. If you would like to see that video, be sure to check that out as well. So with the leveling adjusters buried inside the legs, that would finish up the build of the frame portion of this table, and now it was time to move on to the top. So for the top, I used Southern Yellow Pine, and these are 2x8 by 14 foot boards. So the reason I used 14-foot boards is because, oddly enough, a 14-foot board was just a little more expensive than an 8-foot board, and I needed this table to be about 7 feet long before the breadboards went on. So if I got 14-foot boards and cut them in half, that would save me a lot of money rather than using 8-foot boards individually. So I cut all of them in half at about 7 feet long, and then after they were cut to that length, it was time to move on to the jointer. And so we begin the milling process in similar fashion to how we did the apron earlier. So we first joint the face of one of these boards, and we're going to do all the boards in the same fashion, but for this example we'll go through one board. We joint the face, and then we go to the edge, having that face that we jointed up against the fence in the back, which is what will keep all of the boards square as we cut them on the jointer. So normally you'll joint one edge and then you will rip the other edge off in the table saw. Because these boards are longer and I still don't have an outfeed table on my table saw, I just jointed both edges. Now this technically isn't correct because they're not exactly parallel, but it was very, very close and good enough for this. So still had a flat edge. There may have just been a slight taper, but it was so slight that it wasn't even noticed. Additionally, the boards were already about the exact width that I wanted them, so I was able to joint both edges to get them to the width that I wanted for the top. After I was done with the joiner, I headed over to the planer and I planed the opposite side of the face that I had previously jointed. I usually run every board through the planer twice, and having a joiner has really cut down on the amount of planing that I have to do, as well as truly being able to mill each of the boards that I'm working with to a square. After we were finished up with the planer, all the boards were ready to be assembled as the top, so I laid everything out first to check the orientation. Also, whenever I do this step, I like to look over the boards on both sides to make sure that I get the best side of each board on top. So maybe if there's an ugly knot or something rough, I'll try to put that on the bottom side of the tabletop so that it won't be seen. So if you look closely here, you can see how well of a job that the joiner does as far as milling these boards up. So I have my hand on the seam of where these boards join together, and you can see that there almost is no separation. One other thing is to rotate the orientation of each board in the order, so you can see here the growth rings go up on one and then down on the other. That'll keep the top from warping and twisting over time. So if you're able to do that with a good seam, definitely try to do that on all of your tabletops. After I had decided on the best orientation or the look that I wanted all the boards to have, I laid out bar clamps and then I put the boards on the bar clamps. Next, I just put glue on the edge of each of these. Now, I used to use dowels, and you could also use biscuits to line these boards up. If you get a flat edge with a joiner, I really don't think it's necessary. Glue will be plenty strong, and the alignment is good enough to where you can smooth it out with a hand plane and a sander. So I used a couple spare boards I had laying around as cauls for this glue up. So how this works is that you will put each board on top of the tabletop and then you clamp it down to your workbench or whatever surface it's on. Assuming that that surface that you are clamping it to is level, then it'll force the tabletop to become level along with that since it's clamped down to that same shape. Also, because the cauls are a little bit higher up, you can put a clamp on there to smooth out any gaps. That's what I'm doing here with these smaller bar clamps, which especially helps on the end since that's where the breadboards will go. Now, one other trick here that I like to use is if you have any scrap pieces laying around, you can break those into smaller pieces and put them in between the actual tabletop and where the clamps go. Sometimes whenever you tighten the clamps too much on the edges of the board, it'll leave an indentation where that clamp was, so putting a board that spaces that out there will help prevent that and give you a better shape overall on the ends. So I grabbed a level to double check that everything was level as well as flat. Now if you don't have a level, you can just use a board or any type of straight edge to make sure that there are no big gaps in the board. And then this is what the tabletop looked like when everything was glued up. So I let everything set for a couple days just because I was busy and I wasn't able to get to it. Usually a day is good enough, but I let it set, and then when it was dry, I just took the clamps off. Everything glued up really flat, and this is one of the best tabletops that I've done so far. So despite everything gluing up really flat, there was still a little bit of a ledge here or there on the top between the boards, so I hand planed this down. Now this is actually a step that I don't mind whatsoever. I enjoy using the hand plane. So I flattened each of those ledges out with the hand plane, sucked up the chips, and then I was able to sand the top down. So at this point, I'm just roughly sanding the top down to get any of the big ledges that are still there out, as well as clean the ends up because I'm going to flush cut those edges to put the breadboards on. So to start out with the breadboard, we obviously need to have each side of this table cut flat at a flat line. So I'm using my track saw to do this. So I just put the track on, line it up with the square, and then make the cut across this, and this will cut a perfectly flat line all the way across for the breadboard to go on. If you don't have a track saw, you can do this exact same thing with a circular saw and an edge guide or a straight edge. I just happen to be really bad with a circular saw, so that's why I use my track saw for this step. So to attach the breadboards on the end of this, I'm going to use a sliding dovetail joint. So I first needed to stand the table on its side so I could cut the dovetail with my router. Before I got to that step, I first needed to actually cut the breadboard. So here is just an extra board that I had. You can see my dust collection is doing great in this step. But I cut this to the length and then I put the router on using a dovetail bit. I'm going to cut a channel all the way down this. Now this does work and it actually allows for wood movement the way that it should, but this is a difficult process and I honestly wouldn't recommend this. If you want to see more detail on how I do this, I made a separate video a while back, which I will go into full detail on this process. I'll put a link to that in the description if you want to check this out. Now this actually isn't that hard to make the cuts, but it is hard to get everything set up. So I had to practice on a bunch of scrap pieces to get the dovetail on the router table just right so it would fit down in there perfectly. After I have that set up, then I just run the breadboard on one side of the router table, which will cut that dovetail groove out on one side, and then I will flip the orientation of that over, cut it on the other side. So like I said, the cuts themselves aren't that hard, but getting the fence lined up to where it is exactly perfect to leave a router bit tongue left over that fits in the groove we previously cut, well, that's not the easiest thing to do. That said, it does properly work and it will allow for wood movement, so if you want to give it a go, I'm definitely not going to stop you because you've got to live your own life. But just be aware that this does take a lot of precision and it can take some time as well as lead to frustration sometimes whenever things don't line up. So I use the hammer to tap it in place. If the hammer takes a while, you can also use a pipe clamp to draw across the tabletop, which will get that breadboard into place. This also takes a while, as you can see here, but it does work. So eventually I did get it tapped into place and fully secured with that dovetail joint. All right, guys, so at this point we got the tabletop looking really good. The breadboards are on, and so at this point I had a little mishap with the camera. I did a couple things and it didn't record, so I'm going to walk you through the next couple steps I did, and then I'll show you some footage of a different tabletop where I did the exact same things that I'm going to talk about. So whenever I put these breadboards on, I usually leave them a little bit long, maybe 1/2 inch to 1 inch on each side, and then I'll cut them flush with this part of the table using the track saw. So that part didn't record, so this is what that will have looked like. So like I mentioned, this is old footage unfortunately, but this is a pretty easy process. All you do is put the track parallel to the tabletop itself, and then you flush cut the breadboards off using the track saw. Pretty easy and works well overall. Alright, so now that the breadboards would be cut flush, I also put the track saw on them and cut them to a little bit shorter of a width. Here's what I mean by that. So they were a little too wide this way, so all that I did was to put the track down and then run the saw across that and cut a couple inches off of this side. This is what it would have looked like, so this breadboard would extend out a little bit further this way, and all that I did was plunge down and then cut across to shorten up the length of the breadboard that way. So after the breadboards were cut flush here and shortened up the width a little bit this way, I sanded the top down to 220 with sanding. Now that's okay that I didn't record that part because sanding is boring and nobody wants to watch that anyway. After I had the top sanded down, I used a round over bit with the router to trim the edge all the way around the perimeter of the tabletop, and here's what the edge looks like after it's cleaned up with the router. So I just lied, but what I meant to say is here's the process of me trimming the edge with a router. So again, this is recycled footage unfortunately, but this is a round over bit, gives the edge a nice detailed look. Now this footage here is on the actual table that I'm making in this video, so you can see here that that edge is softened. There's a nice round over with a little bit of a lip left on top for some extra detail. And so now that we have the breadboards cut with the track saw and the perimeter trim with the router, we can get back to the actual video now. So the rest of the footage is all on this tabletop. I only missed those couple scenes with recording with my camera, so we'll get right back into the action. So after I had a word with my camera about it deciding to not record, I only had a couple things left, so I flipped the table over, and now what I'm doing here is gluing a dowel in the middle piece of the table, which will connect to that breadboard to keep the breadboard in place. I'm using a Forstner bit, and I'm only drilling about halfway through until I hit the breadboard, which you can see I did there because the grain orientation is different. And then I'll glue a dowel in and cut that flush. So the reason that I'm doing this is to keep the breadboard in place. Now the breadboard is technically free up until this point, so theoretically it could slide all the way out. Now that'll obviously never actually happen, but gluing a dowel in the center of this does keep the breadboard pinned in one place, so if there is expansion and contraction, it'll only happen to a small degree on each side rather than in one way or the other. After I prevented the breadboards from getting up and walking away, the only thing I needed to do left with the top was fill in the knots, so I'm just using some Starbond CA glue. Put the Starbond CA glue in and then you hit it with the activator and it instantly dries, giving you a nice surface. This way there won't be any holes either in the top, in the knots, or any gaps whenever you have the table finished where something could get down into. The very last step of this tabletop was to sand down everything on top, so I sanded down those Starbond spots from earlier, and then I just sanded everything down to 220 to make sure it was nice and smooth on top and there would be a good finish for whenever I apply stain later. At this point we pretty much have a table other than the table being attached to the top, so I will do that with Z-clips, but that will be in the next video, so stay tuned for that. So that'll wrap everything up. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you found this video useful, leave a comment below. Let me know what you thought, what you liked or didn't like on this table. Make sure you stay tuned because in an upcoming video not long from now, I'll show you how I finished this table as far as the collar, stain, and paint. I'm going to try to do something that I've never done before, so you won't want to miss out on that. So if you made it this far, thank you for watching. As always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and stay tuned for more.